So here we are today starting our Wild Sarasota Hawks of Florida presentation. And I am Dr. Catherine Clements. I'm the Ecology and Natural Resources Educator at University of Florida IFAS Extension here in Sarasota County. And in my position, I provide education for both youth and adults, basically anyone of all ages. And I assist our community with questions and concerns and information about wildlife, native and invasive plant and animal species. I do some programs on the health benefits of nature, and I also do in-person eco walks at our Sarasota County parks and preserves. I have a bachelor's of science in environmental studies from State University of New York in Buffalo, and I did that for a number of years, working with all sorts of ages, doing environmental and outdoor education, and then decided to become a physician and did that for about 15 years before coming full circle to this position about 5 years ago. I also have lived in a state park here in Sarasota County I lived in it for almost 20 years until just about a year ago when we moved out of the state park when my husband decided to work for county instead of state. And a little bit about our extension office in case you're not familiar with it. The extension offices in the state of Florida are partnerships between the counties they're in, and there is an extension office associated with all 67 counties in the state of Florida. And if you're not joining us from Florida, there are extension offices in every state in our country as well. So here in Sarasota County, we're a partnership between Sarasota County, the University of Florida, and the USDA. And our mission is basically to use all the research and references and resources available to us through the university to help our local communities through education, outreach, and volunteer opportunities. We provide practical education to help residents, professionals, and decision makers build a better future for our county. So as you can see on the screen, we have a variety of subject areas that we provide education, assistance, and programming in. So if you haven't taken advantage of any of those other programs and classes, many of them are still online. And of course, we are having in-person programming now as well. So please join us. We have lots of resources for you. These are just some of the programs that we do here in Sarasota County. I work mostly with the Florida Master Naturalist program up here in the upper right corner. I'm a lead instructor for that program, and through Sarasota County Extension, we teach every single class in that program. I think there's 10 or 11 of them now. So we're going to back up before we talk about hawks specifically. We are going to talk about raptors. And we're just going to talk about some of the things that characterize what a raptor is. So a raptor is a bird of prey, so they are carnivorous and eat other animals. Often that's mammals, but it can be reptiles, amphibians, and even birds. So some of the birds we're going to talk about today eat other birds. And raptors are characterized by having 8 sharp talons, 4 on each foot, and very strong feet. And raptor is Latin for to grasp or to seize. And some of our raptors have very interesting, unique adaptations to those talons. Some of them have zygodactyl talons, meaning they can move their back toes around to the front if they want. Some of them have an opposable back toe or talon. So in many ways that helps them to do what they need to do, which is grasp, seize, and kill their prey. They also have a hooked upper beak that helps them dismantle their prey. And they have well-developed eyes that take up a large portion of their skull. Some of our raptors will see 8 to 10 times better than humans. And then they also have 3 eyelids. They have a nictitating membrane. Alligators have that as well, for instance. And that's a 3rd eyelid that actually just helps to protect their eyes as well as sort of keep their eyes clear. So what services do raptors provide within our ecosystem? Well, because they are predators, they help keep our ecosystem in balance. They eat a lot of what we might consider our pest animals, like rodents, for instance. and they keep some of those smaller prey items or mesopredators, like middle-sized mammals. If it's a large raptor, they'll eat a middle-sized mammal. They keep those in balance so that we are not overrun by things like rats and raccoons, which I love, but I don't want to be overrun by them. And they are also an indicator of environmental health. So many of you, if you've seen my eagle presentation, we talk about the risks that DDT pose to eagles. And that was an indication of a type of pollutant that was biomagnified up through the food chain into the eagle's body and then affected the formation of the eggshells of the eagles and put them basically on the endangered species list. So DDT has affected a number of our other raptors as well. Just eagles were the big story on that, but it wasn't just eagles. Lead can be an impact if some of these raptors are eating animals that have been shot with lead in them. And mercury can biomagnify as well. So a number of different indicators of environmental health through these animals. And here's just sort of a laundry list of different groups of raptors that are found here in North America. I have a separate presentation on eagles as well as a separate presentation on owls. And then we are continuing to develop more of our raptor presentations throughout the rest of this year. So I thought I'd put together a little phylogeny, which is just sort of like a family tree of how some of these different raptors are related. I don't have everybody on here, but some of the ones that are more closely related or hard to identify from hawks, I have put on this list. So when we're talking about our hawks, we're in the animal kingdom, of course. They are vertebrates, so they're in phylum Chordata. They are birds, so they are in class Aves. And then our hawks are going to be in order Accipitiformes. And I might have not said that correctly, but I was pretty close. So all the hawks are within this order, and they're within the Accipitridae family. And then they split out according to some characteristics into a couple different genuses. We have the genus Buteo, which are what I consider to be what most of us think of or identify visually as hawks. These are sort of traditional looking hawks. And then we have genus Cercis, which is going to just be the northern harrier here in Florida. And then we have genus Accipiter, which are the Cooper's hawk and the sharp-shinned hawk. So these are the birds that we're going to talk about today. And then in future presentations, we will cover the osprey, which is in a separate family. Within the family that hawks are in are also eagles and kites. So as I mentioned, I already have a presentation just mostly on bald eagles with a little bit of golden eagle thrown in. And kites will be in an upcoming presentation as well. And then hawks are often confused or closely associated with falcons. In fact, they all used to be in the same order, but in 2008, DNA evidence indicated that they really were separate and actually more closely related to parrots and songbirds, Paciformes, or the small songbirds. They're more closely related to them than they are to hawks, which is sort of surprising. So the falcons are now in their own order, in their own family, and then that includes the genus Falco, which are here in Florida, the peregrine falcon, the American kestrel, and the merlin, as well as genus Caracara, which is our beautiful Caracara that here in Sarasota County you can see in the eastern parts of our county, as well as in other counties in central Florida. So we will also talk about falcons and Caracara in an upcoming presentation, as well as the turkey vulture and black vulture, which are also now in their own order. So that's sort of how things break out taxonomically for some of these birds that are in the raptor category and are related to or look like or act like hawks. So just to separate a little bit from hawks and falcons, I already just talked about how they're in different orders taxonomically. Hawks are medium to large size birds of prey, and we have medium sized falcons, but we also have some small ones as well. So falcons in general tend to be a little smaller, but not always. That isn't completely true because the caracara is pretty large. But both hawks and falcons are diurnal raptors, which separates them from our strigiformes, which is our owl category. And there's a whole separate presentation on owls as well if you want to watch that at some point. Worldwide, there are a lot of species within this order that the hawks are in. There's 250 species, give or take, depending on when you look at the most recent taxonomy, whereas falcons have about 66 species worldwide. So they're going to share some general raptor characteristics like the strong talons and the hooked beaks. Although our falcons often will have a notched bill. So when we do the falcon presentation, you'll be able to see that. Whereas you're not going to really see a notched bill in our hawks. Our hawks are going to use their keen eyesight. They're going to generally mate for life. And most of our raptors have sexual dimorphism, except our vultures. So most of our raptors, the females are larger, sometimes a third larger than the males. Another difference is that hawks will use their talons to kill their prey, whereas falcons usually use their beaks to kill their prey. So hawks will grab their prey to kill it, whereas falcons are going to actually bite their prey often at the back of the neck and kill it that way. The wings are also often different. So hawks, especially our buteo hawks, are going to have very broad wings and they're more built for soaring, whereas our falcons are going to have longer pointed wings that are really built for fast flying and maneuvering. All right, so let's get right into our hawks. So this is the most common hawk that I see in Sarasota County, the red-shouldered hawk. We do have other hawks, but this is the one that hands down I see the most commonly. I don't know if that's the case for other people that are on the call from Sarasota, but our red-shouldered hawk is quite abundant here in Sarasota and through a lot of the state of Florida. There are actually 5 subspecies of the red-shouldered hawk. There are 4 that are in the eastern part of our country and their ranges can overlap, but then the West Coast form that's in the Pacific Northwest is sort of separated from all of the other eastern forms. And that West Coast form tends to be more intense in its coloration and has a rustier red head than our eastern forms. The southern form, which you see here on the picture, the one that you're going to see in Florida, tends to be one of the more paler subspecies or forms, and it has more of a grayish head and very faint barring on its chest. So its coloration isn't as intense as some of the other forms. Our northeastern birds will migrate south for the winter, so you might see a variety of red-shouldered hawks here in the wintertime. So the ones you see here may live here year-round and may look like the one you see on the screen and be that paler form, or you may see the migrants from up north, which may look a little bit different. So the red-shouldered hawk, if you were to ever see one next to a red-tailed hawk, which wouldn't that be wonderful? It's like trying to identify a longleaf pine. If you can see a longleaf pine next to a southern slash pine, maybe you can identify them apart from each other, but if you see them separately, it's not quite as easy. But if you had a red-shouldered hawk sitting next to a red-tailed hawk on a branch, the red-tailed hawk is going to be bigger. The red-shouldered hawk is going to be smaller. And I have the wingspan there. They have about a 3 to like 3.5 foot wingspan. Their wings are black and white checkered, which you see here. They have that rusty reddish barring on their chest. And here you see sort of their shoulder, hence their name red-shouldered hawk. And I'm going to show you a picture of one in flight in a moment, where even from the underneath side, you often can see that red shoulder area. The tail is going to be black and has narrow white bands, which you'll see another picture of that in a minute. The wing tips, when they're in flight, the very, very tips of the feathers will have pale crescents on their tips. So our immature birds, often our immature birds have less intense coloration. So our immature red-shouldered hawks are going to be more brown above with white underneath that is streaked with brown. So not quite as much black and rusty color. So here's one in flight. This is from a marsh in Southwest Florida. You can really see those reddish feathers. So this is the shoulder area right here, and this is what we often call the wrist in a bird right here. So that whole area from shoulder to wrist and even beyond the wrist tends to have that reddish coloration. So our red-shouldered hawks are going to fly very much like other buteo hawks, which for instance is our red-tailed hawk. They're going to soar. Remember, they have these very broad wings. So they're going to soar with their wings and their tails spread out like we see here. And then they can flap their wings quickly to glide underneath the tree canopy. So if you see them up in open sky up high, they're often going to be soaring with their wings and tails spread out. But if you see them in a forest canopy and they're trying to get somewhere, then that's when they can flap more quickly and fly through the canopy. And then they can be a little bit confused with looking more like one of the accipiters that tend to flap and then glide. Let's see what else I want to say. Here you can see the black tail with the thin white barring. It's very obvious in this particular picture. And then those crescents on the wingtips I was talking about, see on the primary wing, primary flight feathers right here, you see just this crescent of white and even all the way down here. Okay, so those are some of the identifying characteristics. These birds can, unless you're an amazing birder, which I am not, I'm sort of a mediocre birder. So if you're just a beginning or mid-level birder, sometimes these birds can be hard to tell apart from each other. So noticing some of these identifying characteristics, and then we're going to look at pictures, obviously, of the other species and try to differentiate a little bit. So these birds are going to tend to be forest raptors. They like bottomland hardwood stands. They like flooded deciduous swamps and upland mixed deciduous conifer forests. They like the subcanopy to be sort of open, so they don't like a really thick lower subcanopy, because a thick subcanopy is going to make it hard for them to fly and hunt. But also red-shouldered hawks do fine in suburban areas. So a number of these raptors have really been able to adapt to living in suburban areas, and this is one of them. They can be aggressive and territorial, and there is sort of a common thing with raptors that crows and blackbirds and grackles will often mob some of these raptors and try to irritate them and move them on. Partially so those birds don't get eaten. But it's interesting because our red-shouldered hawk will also join some of those same birds to mob larger raptors like great horned owls. Great horned owls will eat a lot of things. They're one of our largest predatory birds here in Sarasota County and throughout Florida. So great horned owls will actually take nestling hawks as prey. So this mobbing behavior is really an irritation behavior to try to move those predatory birds away. So our red-shouldered hawks will eat small mammals, amphibians, and reptiles. They will either perch and then dive down to grab them, or they can grab them on the wing while flying too. They have a mating display, often called the sky dance for many of these birds. The male will soar and call, and then make a series of steep dives toward the female, and then climb back up in wide spirals after each of those steep dives. And then when they're ready, that male will make a final rapid dive and then perch upon the female's back to mate. They will share the nest building, which is always nice that the males and females build the nest together, and they will go back and reuse the same nest and just fix it up a little bit, or maybe even nest really close to where they had nested in previous years. They make stick nests that are about 2 feet wide and line them with bark, moss, and lichens. And our red-shouldered hawks will have 2 to 5 eggs, and almost all of our hawks are just going to have 1 brood per year. So that's our red-shouldered hawk. Here's another really great picture. This one doesn't have its tail open, although you can still see a little bit of the barring. But once again, you really see those red shoulders, that rusty color to the breast. Those white crescents on the wingtips, and look at how barred the wings feathers are too. So really keep this in mind as we look at some of our upcoming pictures so that we can try to differentiate between some of these raptors. All right, so here comes the red-tailed hawk. So this is the one that I used to be most familiar with. Growing up in the Northeast, the red-tailed hawk was the most common hawk. And you still are going to see these here in Florida. I just don't see them as often as I see the red-shouldered hawk. So right away, you can notice a difference. You don't see as much of that really clear contrast, black and white barring on the wing feathers or the tail feathers. So that's a really obvious. So there's our red-shouldered, and here's our red-tailed. The other thing you might notice about the red-tailed hawk is that you can see this bar that goes just from the shoulder to the wrist. See the bone right there? That's the wrist bone. Okay, so our red-tailed hawk, there's that strip right there between the shoulder and the wrist. Often their tails will be red, but not always. So it just depends. So you can't always go by that. It's not always super noticeable. So red-tailed hawks are large hawks with sort of those typical buteo, which is their genus, typical buteo proportions. They have those broad, rounded wings that are made for soaring, and that short, wide tail, just like we saw with our red-shouldered hawk. They're going to be rich brown above and more pale below. I'm going to go back again to our red-shouldered. Here's our red-shouldered. So our red-tailed is more pale below without all of that black and white markings. They do have a streaked belly. So notice their chest feathers are white without a lot of streaking or pattern, but their belly has some of those streaks or markings on them. The tail is usually pale below and cinnamon red on the top, although in young birds, it's not as obvious and might be more brown and banded. And to make this even more difficult, there's different morphs. So the dark morphs are more chocolatey brown with a warm red tail, and the rufous morph birds are reddish brown on the chest with a dark belly. So that doesn't really make things easier for us. Their wingspan, as you can see, is quite a bit larger than the red-shouldered hawk was. So once again, our red-tailed hawk is going to be the larger hawk between those two. The ones you're going to see in Florida are going to be residents here in Florida, or maybe a short distance migrator. They aren't going to migrate from thousands of miles away usually. And if you hear a raptor call in a Hollywood movie or a TV show, or I'm aging myself, so let's say on Netflix even, if you hear a raptor call, it's generally a red-tailed hawk call. So they'll use the red-tailed hawk. It has a very unique and specific call, and they'll use that even if they're portraying an eagle or an osprey or some other raptor in a TV show or a movie. They're usually using that red-tailed hawk's call. So here's one that's not as rusty color, but once again, you still see that white chest and the brown markings on the belly. You can somewhat make out that strip on the underside of the wing, but you can see on the top of the wing, it's just more brownish. So our red-tailed hawks are going to prefer open country. They're often seen in fields. They're often seen perched up on telephone poles, fence posts, or in trees. And like many of our buteos, as we said, they're going to soar in those high, wide circles. And when they flap, their wing beats are, they're sort of slow and heavy. When the winds are a little bit higher, the hawks will actually, especially the red-tailed hawk, will fly into the wind and sort of hover without flapping and then just stare at the ground looking for food. When they are going to get their prey, they will do a slow, controlled dive with their legs outstretched and ready to grab their prey. Which is very different from a falcon's dive, which we call a stoop, because it's just a super fast, super steep dive. Our red-tailed hawks eat mostly mammals, things like rodents and rabbits, squirrels. They will take birds as well, although they're going to prefer mammals. And I've seen them eating plenty of snakes, and occasionally they'll even eat carrion, which is another animal that's already dead. I don't see that very often, but they will do that occasionally. And their prey can be a variety of things, and really they can eat anything that weighs anywhere from less than an ounce all the way upwards to 5 pounds. So quite a variety in their prey species. They also will aggressively defend their nests or territory, and they'll chase off other hawks and even bigger birds like eagles and great horned owls. There's a great picture of one. Their mating displays, they'll soar in wide circles way up high, and then the males will dive steeply, then shoot right back up again at a really steep angle. They'll do that a few times, and then I think this is so interesting. Then, whenever they decide they're ready, that male will dive again and then extend its legs and just touch the female ever so briefly. And then they will couple, and often they'll even clasp talons and sort of just, it almost looks like something's wrong, like either they're fighting or they can't let go. They'll clasp talons and come together and sort of start to fall to the ground, but then will release before they hit the ground and fly away. And they also will mate for life unless their partner dies, and then they will likely find another partner. They also share in the nest building activities and reuse a nest from prior years. Their nests can be really large, up to 6.5 feet high and 3 feet wide. So that's a pretty large nest. And they'll line the cup of their nest with bark strips and fresh and or dry vegetation. Also 1 brood and 1 to 5 eggs, depending on how good they are at reproduction or how healthy that year is. For females to produce eggs. And here's another great picture as well. Okay, so for me, the things that really stand out once again is that white breast with the brown stippling on the belly. And then of course, if we see a rufous red tail, then that would be indicative. And also if we see on the underside of the wings, that bar that goes from shoulder to wrist. And then we're going to talk about the short-tailed hawk. So in North America, it's only found in Florida in a population at about 500 or less birds. So I don't know as much about the short-tailed hawk, and I don't think I've seen very many of them either. They tend to be more prolific in Central and South America, but the ones that are here in Florida, they are from Central Florida down, and the ones that are in Central Florida are going to migrate southward to the Everglades and the Keys for the winter. They also have dark and light morphs, but the ones in Florida are more likely to be the dark morph. And the dark morphs have blackish brown plumage that is offset by the silvery white barring in the wings and tail. So you can see that barring here. But one of the ways, for instance, if you were questioning whether or not you were looking at a red-shouldered versus a short-tailed hawk, the barring on the tail of a short-tailed hawk, look at the white portions are much more prominent than the black, or thicker than the black barring. Also, so let's go back to our, oops, sorry, I went too far. Let's go back to our red-shouldered. So seeing our red-shouldered, our black barring is a lot thicker than our white bars are on the tail. And of course, you're more likely to see the red shoulders. You have the rufous breast, and in the red-shouldered, you also have pretty obvious barring on the wing feathers. So now we're going to skip back to our short-tailed. So our short-tailed does have a little bit of barring on the wing feathers, but it certainly is not as distinct and obvious as the red-shouldered, and same with the tail. The light morphs of this bird are going to be more frequent in other parts of its range, like in Central and South America, and it's going to be a little bit more brown above and white underneath. And males and females have identical plumage, but of course the females are much larger. And it's sort of interesting, it's called a short-tailed hawk, but its tail isn't necessarily any shorter than the other buteos that we've just looked at. So you can't really expect that you're going to be able to identify it by its short tail. Often our common names of our species are just somebody's creation, and they aren't always true, and they often are confusing, which is the case here. So our short-tailed hawks are interesting in that they are specialist predators of other birds. So they prey on a variety of species and all different sizes of birds. Here in Florida, they're going to hunt along the edges of sawgrass marshes, mangrove forest, and even areas around humans that are well-treed. Unlike other hawks, the short-tailed hawk will stoop down on their prey more like falcons do. And then I just find this bird to be so unique and beautiful and really interesting. So we're in a new genus now. So we just covered our 3 buteos here in Florida, our red-shouldered hawk, our red-tailed hawk, and our short-tailed hawk. Now we're moving into a different genus, our Cirrus, which is our northern harrier. And in North America, this is the only harrier that we have. And the ones here in Florida may be residents, or they may be northern harriers that have migrated down from the north. So these are a little bit more slender, so a little less sort of stocky or beefy compared to the buteos. They are medium-sized raptors, and they have long, still fairly broad wings with a longer, more rounded tail. So their wings, I would say, are still pretty broad, not quite as broad maybe as the buteos, but still a little bit more broad than our falcons. But the tail is longer than the buteos and a little bit thinner. But what really is going to set aside our northern harrier in terms of identifying characteristics is really its head and face structure. So it has a head and face more like an owl. It really looks a little bit owl-like. Its face is a little bit flat and has a relatively small, sharply hooked beak compared to its head size. The males are gray above and whitish below, and then they have these very noticeable black wingtips. They also have this trailing edge to its wing and a little bit of black bands on the tail. So I would say really looking at the head is going to help identify, as well as the overall body shape, and certainly the black wingtips with this trailing black edge also. The females and immatures are going to be a little bit browner with the black bands on the tail. The adult females will have whitish undersides with brown streaks, whereas the immatures are going to be a little bit more buff colored or beige. So another really great identifying feature that we can't see in this picture, but we're going to see in an upcoming picture, is that all northern harriers have a white rump patch that is obvious, certainly in flight, if you see their upper side, but it sometimes is also obvious even when they're perched. So their wingspan, you can see a little bit closer to our red-tailed hawk. So they're going to be a little bit larger than our red-shouldered hawk, but they really don't look that much alike. So easier to tell apart. So here you see one in flight and you really see this white, what's called a white rump patch. So we're seeing the back of the bird here, not the underside. So you are seeing that white rump. So our northern harriers, they're going to prefer large, undisturbed tracts of wetlands and grasslands, and they like low, thick vegetation. They also have a slightly different flight pattern than our buteos. They're going to occasionally fly with their wings, and you sort of see it in this picture, with their wings held in a dihedral or more of a V shape, and that's similar to our vultures, for instance. They're going to forage on the wing, so forage while they're flying over low fields and marshes. And they will also use their sense of hearing to hunt, which is not very common among the other hawks. And this speaks to some of the facial adaptations that we just mentioned, and the fact that their head and face looks a little bit more owl-like. So they actually, our northern harriers actually have more of a disc-shaped, flatter face, more like an owl, and that acts sort of like a satellite dish does to funnel the sounds of their prey to their ears. So they will use their sense of sight to hunt, but they really depend on their sense of hearing. Not only do they have that facial disc that funnels the sound to their ears, but they also have feathers on their face that they can adjust the angle of those feathers to even make that adaptation more useful and more adeptly funnel the sound. And owls do that as well. So really interesting adaptations in this particular bird. And they will eat small mammals, reptiles, amphibians, and other birds, but they do like to eat their meal on the ground. So that is a little unique as well. So here's another picture where you can more see, like, isn't their head and face just so unique looking? It does look really different than our other hawks. Males have either 1 or 2, or sometimes even up to 5 mates at a time. So another sort of unusual characteristic compared to some of our other hawks, as well as many of our other raptors, that are monogamous and tend to mate for life, or at least stay monogamous through an entire breeding season. This hawk, or this harrier, is actually polygamous, and they are going to supply food to all of their mates and their chicks. So whether or not they have 1 mate, 2 mates, or 5 mates is mostly going to depend upon the abundance of food. So if there's enough food for them to take care of all of those mates and all of those chicks, then they're going to limit how many mates they have in a year. They also have a very sky dance type of mating display. This one is more roller coaster-like and occurs upwards of 1,000 feet off the ground and can cover more than half a mile. So they make a lot of effort in their mating, as well as then their feeding of their mates and babies. Also unique is that they nest on the ground in a dense clump of vegetation, and their nest will be made from things like cattails or willows, and then lined with grasses, sedges, or rushes. Their nest is a little bit smaller than the hawks, the buteo hawks we just talked about. Our northern harrier's nest is going to be about 1.5 to 2 feet wide and only about 1.5 to 8 inches high. So not anywhere near as large as our red-tailed hawk's nest. And they're going to have 4 to 5 eggs and 1 brood. All right, so now we have our accipiters, and we're going to talk about the two that are hardest to tell apart from each other. And me being a very mediocre birder, probably, I don't know if I could tell them apart unless, once again, maybe if they were sitting side by side. But here are the Cooper's hawk and the sharp-shinned hawk side by side, and they're still pretty hard to tell apart from each other. So there can be a lot of difficulty in identifying which one of these you might actually be looking at. All right, so let's talk about our Cooper's hawk first, and then we will talk about the sharp-shinned as well. So Cooper's hawks do tend to be larger than sharp-shinned, and they are about crow size. But once again, the males can be smaller. So a male sharp-shinned hawk might be the same size as, a male Cooper's hawk might be the same size as a female sharp-shinned hawk. So once again, confusing. You can see their wingspan is anywhere from about 2 to 3 feet. So they are one of the smaller birds that we've talked about thus far. The adults are steely bluish gray above, which you see over here, with reddish bars on the underparts and thick dark bands on the tail. The juveniles are brown above, and instead of being more like these horizontal streaks we see, the juveniles, which I think I have a picture coming up of, the juveniles tend to be a little bit more vertically streaked and not as much coloration as we see here in the adults. It says here that sharp-shinned hawks have more diffuse streaking, but I'm not really seeing that obviously on this comparison here. So our Cooper's hawk is one of our most skillful flyers in the entire world. They can fly through tree canopies at high speeds after other birds. Our accipiter genus flies with a flat glide pattern, and our Coopers will attack by flying fast and low to the ground, and then they have this adaptation that helps them sort of surprise their prey, where not only will they fly fast and low to the ground, but they might fly behind an obstruction and then come up really quickly up and over the obstruction to surprise and kill their prey. And I found this really interesting. Once again, this information is on Cornell Laboratories All About Birds, so you can read most of this there and find out more. But on the All About Birds website, it talked about a study that was done of more than 300 skeletons from the Cooper's hawks, and 23%, so almost a quarter of them, showed old healed over fractures in their chest structure, especially the wishbone, which is right here in their chest. And so indicative that yes, they are flying fast, and sometimes unfortunately they are flying into things, and perhaps to the point that that causes mortality to them. Excuse me. So males, like most of our raptors, are quite smaller than females, but in this species especially, the male may actually become prey to the female. So sort of an interesting aspect to that. They capture their prey with their feet, and then they hold the prey away from their body until the prey dies. They've even been seen to hold their prey underwater to drown it. So I think that's really unique too. And sometimes if you're having trouble identifying birds based off of their coloration, their patterns, their size, some of their physical characteristics, if you see a certain behavior that's unique to a bird, or they're in a unique environment or habitat that you know might be where they live as opposed to a different species, some of those other cues can really help you with identification. They eat medium-sized birds such as doves, pigeons, robins, jays. They'll even eat chickens. They'll also rob nests to eat other birds or eat nestlings. And they'll also eat mammals such as chipmunks, hares, mice, squirrels, and even bats. And both the Cooper's hawk and then their look-alike sharp-shinned hawks can be unwanted guests at bird feeders. So of course, not only are bird feeders easy sort of fast food for other species of birds, they then draw those other species of birds to them. And if a Cooper's or sharp-shinned hawk figures out that that's an easy place to get a meal, they might start hanging around your bird feeder. The recommendation for that, if you do have one of these raptors hanging around and eating your songbirds, excuse me again, the recommendation for that is to not put birdseed out for a few days so that maybe some of those songbirds stop coming around briefly. Then the raptors will go elsewhere looking for a meal, and then you can refill the bird feeder, and hopefully the songbirds will come back and not the raptors. So here's that immature one that I mentioned. So you can see the immature is much more drab in its coloration, much more brown, and that streaking on its breast and belly are a little bit more vertical than horizontal. So here's the adult, and there's the immature. Also notice the difference in eye coloration. So our immature Cooper's hawks are going to have yellowish eyes, and then as they become adults, their eyes turn more of a reddish color. So because the males are so much smaller than the females, and in this species can become prey to the females, males will tend to be very submissive to the females, and they'll actually listen for calls from the females that indicate that the females are welcoming them to approach as opposed to being eaten. Males build the nest in this species, and then, as I mentioned, provide nearly all the food to females and young for the first 3 months before the young fledge. Their nests are a pile of sticks and about 2 feet wide and 6 to 17 inches high, and they'll have about 2 to 6 eggs. So most of our raptors are having somewhere between like 1 to 5 eggs, and most of them only have 1 brood per year. Or I shouldn't say raptors, but the hawks that we're talking about today. So our sharp-shinned hawk is our lookalike to our Coopers. And this is our smallest hawk in North America, in both Canada and the United States. And they will migrate out of Canada in the fall and can be observed along hawk watch sites in large numbers, up to thousands of them at a time. They have distinctive long legs, short wings, and very long tails. So you can see here, gosh, the tail is almost like 1/2 to 2/3 the length of its actual body. And that helps them to navigate through the forest where they go after their prey of songbirds and mice. So once again, they're going to be smaller, so they're going to eat smaller things. They have small heads that in flight don't appear, when you're looking at them visually as they're flying, the head does not appear to go beyond the wrist joint of the wings. I think I have a picture of that. Yeah, so right here. So here's that wrist joint. So the head is either equal or sometimes even looks a little bit lower than that wrist joint. So small heads. The tail has dark bands and tends to be square tipped and may show a notch at the tip. And just like our Coopers, the adults are slate blue-gray above, and then they have this narrow horizontal rusty banding on their breast. The immatures, also like the Coopers, are mostly brown with those coarse vertical streaks. So here's one in flight. Here you can sort of see that notch that I just mentioned in the tail. So that may not always be visible, but sometimes is. You can see the banding here. So for our sharp-shinned hawk, they're going to eat about 90% of their diet in songbirds. So robins or smaller, because once again, this is a smaller hawk, but they will also eat rodents and even an occasional moth or grasshoppers. So they will eat some insects. Also, because the males are so much smaller, I find this really interesting too. During nesting, and once the babies are born, the males will feed the babies first because they are smaller and catching smaller prey. And then as the babies grow and can eat larger prey, the feeding behavior then transitions over to the female feeding the babies. Also, the male sharp-shinned hawks will typically remove and eat the head of the prey before offering it to the babies, the female, or themselves. They also will use their long toes and talons to impale and hold their prey. And they've even been known to reach through wire mesh in order to grab something with their talons. They carry their prey to a stump or low branch, and they will actually pluck it before eating it. They do not swallow feathers of birds like owls do. Owls will just swallow the whole prey down, and then of course owls will cough up the owl pellets of all the feathers and bones that were not digestible, whereas our sharp-shinned hawks are going to pluck their prey. And they can have 3 to 8 eggs. All right, so we're going to bring it to a close now so that we have some time for questions and answers. I'm going to talk just a little bit about living with raptors, and then we will have time for Q&A. So during the breeding season, which is typically spring and summer, these species of hawks can be very protective of their mate, their nest, their eggs, and their chicks, and they will occasionally dive or swoop at people or our pets that come close to their nest, and that may be even within 150 feet of their nest. So this can be really concerning behavior if a hawk is diving at you with their talons out. It is unusual for them to make contact, if that makes you feel any better. If this does happen, rarely is it actually an attack that where they make contact with you or your pet. It's more of a defensive measure where they're trying to scare you off. But if you are having conflicts with hawks, if this is an issue that's a little bit more of a concern where you live, then this is what the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission recommends to do. So of course you want to avoid going near the nest if possible. If you do have to get near a nest, like let's say they're nesting near your home and there's not really anything you can do to avoid the nest, you can carry an open umbrella so that if they dive, they're going to dive more for the umbrella, or you can wear a hard hat to help you feel safer. You can also place signs up in areas where there might be pedestrians to let other people know. So if you do have a hawk nesting in your neighborhood, you might want to put a sign up, or if you have sort of a neighborhood watch committee that can communicate with the neighborhood, something like that. Just let others know so that they don't have to be worried, or they can take some of these measures themselves. You can erect a shade structure temporarily, which basically just blocks the bird's view of you and your pets. And if they don't see you, then they're not going to be disturbed by you. You can use some other defensive measures, which are a little bit more intense, like using an air horn, but you don't want to use an air horn when they're just in their nest or perching on a tree. You don't want to use it until they actually are diving, because once again, these birds have a right to be there, and anything that we do that actually irritates or stresses them makes them less likely to have babies, be able to take care of their babies if they do have them, or even to breed or build a nest to begin with. So we don't want to use that air horn except as one of our last resorts, and only if a bird is starting to dive. When they are not breeding, but you know that they might come to your neighborhood, you can trim branches near your home to minimize the chance of them perching or building a nest there. And you always, for pretty much any type of wildlife interaction or potential conflict, you always want to eliminate food sources to wildlife. And some of the food sources that we sometimes don't think about can be unsecured garbage that wildlife can get into, pet food that we've left outside. So please feed pets indoors, not outdoors. There's all sorts of wildlife that will come to pet food that's left outside. Fallen fruit or seed at feeders are other sources of unexpected feeding. And all of these things can attract prey like rodents into your yard, which you don't want anyways. You don't want the rodents there, but then they're prey for these raptors that then will follow them into your yard. And then you want to secure small livestock, such as chickens and rabbits, in a covered and fenced structure. So I had chickens for many, many years until just recently. And really, we had to basically build Fort Knox in order to keep our chickens safe from many wildlife, but certainly raptors. I had an instance where I was standing right in my yard. I had my large chocolate labs outside with me. The chickens were right at my feet, and an owl went right over my head and tried to take one of the chickens from right in front of us. I've also seen red-shouldered hawks perching right above the chicken coop for hours on end, just hoping that they're going to have an opportunity at one of those chickens. So just think about your small livestock as well. And the FWC has a great website and information about living with raptors. So all this information came from there. They have a pamphlet that you can print out about living with raptors that has even more information than I just shared. And lastly, all of these birds are protected by both federal and state law. So this means the birds themselves, their feathers, their nests, and their eggs are all protected. Inactive nests where there are no young birds or eggs present can be removed without a permit as long as it's a nest of a non-listed species. So can't be threatened or endangered. But nests of eagles, crested caracaras, snail kites, and American kestrels cannot be removed. And if a raptor nest is active, then you actually need a removal permit from the federal government, from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. If you need information on any of this, you can either go to our Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission website or call their regional office. All right, so if you enjoyed this webinar, which I hope you did, and if you're new to us, then we have many more of these. We do Wild Sarasota webinars on our local wildlife once a month, and you register for those just like you did for this one on Eventbrite. And we also have them recorded and then on demand on YouTube. So any ones that I have done are on YouTube, available for you to watch and enjoy. Don't forget to visit your local Audubon societies. Here in Sarasota County, we are lucky enough to have two. We have the Sarasota Audubon Society out on Center Road by the celery fields. And that's an amazing site for birding. And then we have the Venice Area Audubon Society down behind the Sarasota County building on Tamiami Trail in Venice. And they have a rookery there. It's a great place to go. I went there a few weeks ago and took over 300 pictures in an hour of all the young birds. And they also have bat houses that I often do programs at as well. So as I mentioned a number of times, most of the information from this came from that Cornell University All About Birds website, as well as some information from the FWC and also from the raptortrust.org. And I want to thank you all for watching with me today. And please feel free to reach out to me anytime for any questions you have, or if you need help with any wildlife issues or identifications. People are always sending me photos of tracks and scat and other types of animal sign to help identify for them who's been visiting their backyard. So I'm happy to do that. Please feel free to reach out to me at my Sarasota County email that you see on the screen there.